The radio had been silent for 11 minutes. In the Tactical Operations Center buried beneath Forward Operating Base Valor, that silence weighed heavier than any explosion. Major Rick Halloran stood before the main display, watching three blue icons motionless on the digital map. Three squads, 47 men, surrounded in a valley that tactical doctrine said was indefensible. The Afghan mountains had swallowed them whole, and every asset within 200 miles was either grounded by weather or already burning fuel over higher priority targets. Halloran had commanded men for 19 years, and he'd learned to recognize the specific quality of silence that preceded catastrophe. This was that silence. Captain DeMarco paced behind him, phone pressed to his ear, arguing with someone at Bagram about aerial support that would never arrive in time. Through the static-filled speakers, they could hear fragments of desperate radio calls from the valley, gunfire, screaming, then nothing. The Taliban had been moving fighters into those mountains for 3 weeks, and intelligence had missed it completely. Now 3 squads were paying the price for that failure. Halloran had already drafted the letters in his mind, the ones he'd have to sign before sunrise. He was reaching for the radio handset to order the medevac birds to stand down when someone in the back of the operations center said something that made everyone stop. "Sir, we've got an A-10 inbound, single aircraft. She's requesting clearance into the valley." Halloran turned slowly. "What? We don't have any warthogs assigned to this sector." The junior officer manning the air operations desk looked up from his screen, confusion evident. "Call sign Widunine." She's squawking friendly, broadcasting encrypted IFF. Says she was returning from a patrol run, monitored our distress frequency. She's asking for grid coordinates and target descriptions. DeMarco lowered his phone. "Tell her negative. Tell her the valley's a dead zone. Weather's below minimums, we've got 3 squads pinned in a crossfire, and enemy positions are too close to friendly forces for effective strafing runs." "Tell her, she says she's aware of the tactical situation," the officer interrupted, pressing his headset closer. "She's requesting immediate clearance anyway, sir. She sounds very certain." Halloran stared at the map. The blue icons hadn't moved. Standard procedure said to deny the request. Standard procedure said one pilot couldn't change the mathematics of this situation. Standard procedure said a lot of things, and right now, 47 men were dying in a valley while he followed standard procedure. He picked up the handset. "Widunine, this is Valor Actual. Say your fuel state and armament." The voice that came back was calm, almost unnervingly so, with the flat affect of someone who'd already made every calculation that mattered. "Valor Actual, Widunine. Fuel sufficient for 30 minutes on station. Full combat load. 1,100 rounds 30mm, 6 Maverick missiles, mixed ordnance. Requesting immediate clearance and updated enemy positions. I'm 2 minutes out from the valley entrance, descending through 8,000 feet. Weather's marginal but flyable. Those men don't have 30 minutes actual. They probably don't have 10. So unless you've got something better positioned than an A-10 with a pilot who knows these mountains, I suggest you give me those coordinates." Halloran looked at DeMarco, who shrugged with the exhausted gesture of a man who'd run out of options. "Widunine, you're cleared into the valley. Be advised we have 3 friendly units surrounded by estimated 200 enemy fighters in prepared positions. Danger close authorization is granted. God help you, Widunine." "Copy danger close authorization. Widunine is going in. Keep your men's heads down, actual. This is going to get loud." The radio clicked off, and for 3 seconds, nobody in the operations center moved. Then Halloran turned to the room. "Get me a live feed from any ISR assets we have overhead, and somebody find out who the hell Widunine actually is." The intelligence officer was already typing furiously. "Sir, call sign Widunine is assigned to Captain Nix Keller. She's been flying close air support rotations out of Kandahar for 7 months. Prior service history shows 3 deployments, 217 combat missions," and the officer stopped, his face going pale. "And what, Lieutenant?" "And a reputation, sir. The ground units call her something else. They call her the Reaper's daughter." DeMarco whistled low. "I've heard that name. Thought it was just another war story." It's not a story, the intelligence officer said quietly. 6 months ago, she kept an entire Marine platoon alive for 4 hours after they walked into an ambush outside Sangin. Flew repeated gun runs so low the Taliban were shooting at her with AKs. Her aircraft took 17 hits. She landed with one engine on fire and hydraulics failing. Halloran's jaw tightened. He'd heard fragments of that story through the informal networks that connected combat units. But like most legends that circulated through the war, he'd assumed it had been exaggerated, polished smooth by retelling until the truth was buried under myth. Now that legend was diving into a valley that had already killed better-equipped units. On the main display, a new icon appeared, a green triangle representing Widonine, moving fast toward the cluster of blue and red that marked the battle. Halloran watched it descend, dropping altitude with a speed that suggested either supreme confidence or suicidal intent. Through the speakers, they heard her voice again, this time on the frequency the trapped squads were monitoring. Any Valor units in the valley, this is Widonine. I'm a United States Air Force A-10 coming in from the north. When you hear my gun, mark your positions with IR strobes. Do not, I repeat, do not use colored smoke. Keep your heads down and trust the process. You're going to be fine. Widonine is here. In the operations center, several officers exchanged glances. That last sentence, delivered with absolute certainty, seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere. It wasn't bravado. It was a promise spoken by someone who intended to keep it or die trying. The radio crackled with a response from the valley, a voice hoarse from shouting and fear. Widonine, Saber 2 actual. We are in deep shit down here. Multiple casualties, running low on ammunition. Enemy is everywhere, closing from 3 sides. I don't know if one bird can. Saber 2 actual, Widonine, I'm not one bird. I'm an A-10 and you're about to find out why the Air Force keeps us around. Stand by. Widonine is rolling in hot now. Guns, guns, guns. Then came the sound that would echo through tactical operations reports and combat debrief documents for years afterward. The unmistakable roar of a GAU-8 Avenger cannon opening fire. 7 barrels spinning at 4,000 rounds per minute, each round the size of a milk bottle, fired from an aircraft designed specifically to kill things on the ground. Through the speakers, they heard it as a long, tearing rip, like God himself shredding the fabric of reality. It lasted 3 seconds, and when it stopped, the radio exploded with voices. Holy shit, holy shit, she just took out the entire ridgeline. They're running. The fuckers are actually running. Halloran leaned closer to the display, watching the infrared feed from a Predator drone that had been repositioned overhead. The thermal imagery showed dozens of heat signatures scattering from positions that had been pouring fire into the trapped American forces. Widonine's aircraft appeared as a bright shape, banking hard, already lining up for another run. Her A-10 was a brutal, ungainly thing, a flying gun with wings attached as an afterthought, designed in an era when elegance mattered less than results. At this altitude, threading through mountain valleys with enemy fire erupting from every ridge, it looked like exactly what it was, a weapon with a pilot inside, rather than the other way around. Saber 2 actual, Widonine. Enemy positions marked by my last gun run are neutralized. I'm rolling in from the east for precision strikes on your north ridge. Keep those IR strobes active and do not move from your positions. Widonine is engaging with Mavericks now. Halloran watched the feed as 2 missiles streaked from the A-10's wings, tracking toward heat signatures clustered behind rock formations. The explosions bloomed white on the thermal display, and more enemy fighters scattered like insects fleeing light. But scattered wasn't the same as destroyed. There were still too many, and the 3 American squads were still surrounded. Keller's voice came through again, and this time Halloran noticed something he'd missed before. Beneath the professional calm, there was something harder, something personal. Valor actual, Widonine. I have visual on multiple technical vehicles moving toward the valley mouth, attempting to cut off your unit's escape route. Engaging with guns, then I'll need updated grids on those prepared positions along the western slope. We're going to clean this valley one piece at a time, actual. But I need you to coordinate ground movement the moment I give the word. Can your squads move? Halloran grabbed the handset. Widow Saber 2 actual reports multiple casualties, unknown number of litter cases, mobile but not fast. Copy. Then we do this the hard way. Tell them to be ready to move in 5 minutes. I'm going to make these bastards wish they'd stayed home today. Widow is rolling in. The A-10 banked again, impossibly steep for an aircraft carrying that much ordnance, and dove toward the valley floor. What followed was the most controlled aggression Halloran had witnessed in 2 decades of warfare. Keller worked the valley systematically, dividing it into sectors and clearing each one with a combination of cannon fire and precision missiles. She called out targets before engaging, her voice a steady metronome of tactical information that the trapped squads used to orient themselves. When enemy fighters attempted to regroup, she anticipated their movements and hit them before they could establish new firing positions. When they tried to flee, she cut off their escape routes with barrier runs that turned retreat into massacre. The A-10's cannon became a constant presence, a sound that the American forces learned to associate with survival. Every burst meant enemy positions being torn apart, giving them seconds to reposition, to treat wounded, to breathe. DeMarco stood beside Halloran, watching the drone feed with an expression approaching religious awe. "Sir, I've seen a lot of close air support missions. I've never seen anything like this. She's flying like she knows where every Taliban fighter is before they move." The intelligence officer glanced up from his screen. "She probably does, sir." According to her file, she flew F-16s before transitioning to A-10s. Forward Air Controller qualified, Special Operations Liaison graduated top of her class in weapons and tactics. And before the Air Force, she grew up in Alaska. Bush pilot family. She's been flying in terrain like this since she was 14. Halloran nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the display. The green triangle representing Widowine was dancing through the valley with a precision that seemed almost choreographed, each movement calculated to maximum effect. But even precision had limits. Even skill ran into mathematics eventually. The Taliban had committed over 200 fighters to this ambush, and Keller was just one pilot in one aircraft. The question wasn't whether she could hold them off. She'd already proven that. The question was how long she could maintain this pace before something went wrong. The answer came 18 minutes into her assault, announced by a sudden change in her voice over the radio. "Valor Actual, Widowine, taking fire from multiple MANPADs South Ridge, deploying countermeasures and breaking off attack run. Stand by." On the drone feed, they watched flares blossom behind the A-10 as it wrenched into a climb so violent that Halloran winced. Shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles left white contrails, chasing the aircraft as it clawed for altitude. The flares worked, the missiles veered off, detonating harmlessly, but the maneuver had cost Keller precious seconds in positioning. The enemy fighters on the ground, sensing opportunity, surged forward toward the American positions. Saber 2 Actual, Widowine. They're pushing again. "I need 3 minutes to reposition. Can you hold?" The response from the valley was strained but determined. "Widowine will hold, just come back. Count on it. Widowine is repositioning now." Halloran watched the A-10 circle wide, gaining altitude while staying below the cloud deck that pressed down on the mountains like a gray ceiling. Keller was adapting, adjusting her tactics to account for the anti-aircraft threat. But that adjustment meant fewer gun runs, longer intervals between strikes. It meant giving the enemy time to recover, to reorganize. In the operations center, the mood had shifted from desperate hope to something more complex, a recognition that they were witnessing something remarkable, but also something fragile. One pilot could accomplish extraordinary things, but she couldn't violate the fundamental laws of physics and probability forever. Eventually, luck ran out. Eventually, skill met its match. DeMarco voiced what everyone was thinking. "Sir, we need to get her some support. If those MANPAD teams box her in, or if she takes a hit to a critical system." "I know," Halloran said quietly. "I'm working on it." But working on it meant calling in favors from units that were already stretched thin, redirecting assets that were already committed elsewhere. It meant explaining to some other commander why his mission mattered less than this valley, this moment. Halloran was still on the phone when Keller's voice came through again, calm as before but with an undercurrent of intensity that made everyone in the room lean closer to the speakers. Valor Actual, Widunine. I've identified the command element. 3 buildings on the western slope, grid reference follows. They're coordinating from there, and they've got spotters feeding targeting data to those MA and PAD teams. If I take out the command post, the rest will fold. Request permission for precision strike with remaining Mavericks. Halloran looked at the grid coordinates being fed to the main display. The buildings Keller had identified were barely 400 meters from the nearest American position. In normal circumstances, that would be well outside the parameters for missile strikes. These weren't normal circumstances. Widunine, Valor Actual, you're cleared for precision strike. Be advised friendly forces are danger close to target area. Copy danger close. Trust me, Actual. I've got this. Widunine is rolling in. What happened next would be dissected in tactical training sessions for years, used as a case study in precision weapon employment under combat conditions. Keller brought her A-10 down to 2,000 feet, flying straight through the valley in full view of every enemy position, drawing fire from dozens of weapons. The tracers that arced toward her aircraft looked like strings of bright beads against the gray sky. She didn't deviate, didn't jink, just held course long enough to achieve perfect weapons parameters. Then she rippled off 3 Maverick missiles in sequence, each one tracking toward a different building. The missiles impacted within a half-second of each other, and the command post ceased to exist. The effect on the enemy forces was immediate and devastating. Without coordination, without leadership, the Taliban fighters' organized resistance collapsed into chaos. Some tried to retreat up the mountain slopes. Others attempted to scatter into the network of caves and ravines that honeycombed the region. Keller hunted them all with methodical efficiency, her cannon tearing apart clusters of fighters, her remaining ordnance blocking escape routes. 22 minutes after entering the valley, she keyed her radio with news that made every person in the operations center exhale simultaneously. Valor Actual, Widunine. Valley is clear. Enemy forces are routed or neutralized. Your ground units are free to move. Recommend immediate extraction before they regroup. I'll maintain overwatch until your people are clear. Halloran's hand shook slightly as he raised the handset. Widunine, Valor Actual, outstanding work, truly outstanding. We're coordinating extraction now. What's your fuel state? There was a pause before she answered, longer than any of her previous responses. Actual fuel is adequate. I can stay on station until extraction is complete. But something in her voice had changed, a tightness that hadn't been there before. DeMarco caught Halloran's eye, shaking his head slightly. Something was wrong. Halloran pressed the transmit button again. Widunine, say again your fuel state and aircraft status. Are you experiencing any malfunctions? Another pause, longer this time. When Keller's voice came back, the professional calm had developed cracks. Valor Actual, I've got some warning lights. Nothing critical. I can maintain station for extraction. Widunine, specify which warning lights. That's an order, Captain. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Then, Actual, I'm showing hydraulic pressure fluctuations in both systems, possible damage to the left engine from ground fire, and fuel transfer issues. I think I took more hits than I initially realized. But I can hold position. Your men need overwatch during extraction. Halloran felt his chest tighten. She'd been flying wounded for God knew how long, maintaining station and conducting attack runs with an aircraft that was slowly bleeding out. And she hadn't said a word because saying something would have meant leaving those squads without protection. Widunine, negative. You are ordered to egress immediately and head for the nearest suitable landing field. We'll provide overwatch with other assets. With all respect, Actual, what other assets? We both know there's nothing else positioned to cover extraction. I'm staying until your men are safe. Widunine will remain on station. DeMarco leaned close to Halloran, whispering urgently. Sir, if she's losing hydraulics and has engine damage, every minute she stays up there increases the risk. We need to order her out now. She won't leave, Halloran said quietly. Not until those men are clear. You heard her. Then we need to move those men faster. Halloran nodded and grabbed a different radio handset, connecting to the tactical frequency used by the ground units. All Sabre elements, Valor Actual, begin immediate extraction. Double time it. Your air cover has taken damage and needs to egress. Move now. On the drone feed, they could see the American squads beginning their movement, carrying wounded, covering each other as they withdrew from positions they'd held under fire for over an hour. Keller's A-10 circled overhead, wobbling slightly in flight, a motion that made Halloran's stomach drop. Aircraft that's stable and solid didn't wobble unless something fundamental was failing. The extraction took 9 minutes that felt like hours. Keller maintained her orbit, calling out clear routes and providing guidance to the ground units. Her voice remained steady, professional, even as the flight characteristics of her aircraft continued to deteriorate. On the thermal display, they could see fluid leaking from her aircraft, hot streams that traced patterns against the cooler mountain air. When the last American soldier crossed into the relative safety of the valley mouth, Halloran immediately keyed the radio. Widow 9, Valor Actual. All personnel are clear. You are ordered to egress immediately. Head for Bagram, they've got the best emergency equipment. We're notifying them now. Copy Actual. Widow 9 is egressing north. Thanks for the coordinates. Widow 9 out. The A-10 turned with agonizing slowness, struggling to maintain altitude as it limped toward the north. On the operations center's main display, someone had pulled up the distance calculation to Bagram Airfield. 93 miles through mountainous terrain with weather deteriorating. DeMarco stared at the numbers. She's not going to make it, is she? Halloran didn't answer because there was nothing to say. They watched the green triangle crawl across the map, moving slower than it should, losing altitude in increments that suggested a losing battle with physics and damage. The radio crackled with Keller's voice again, and this time there was no hiding the strain. Valor Actual, Widow 9. I'm going to need you to contact Bagram and tell them I'm coming in on emergency status. Left engine is failing, hydraulics are almost gone, and I'm losing control authority. I'm going to try to keep her in the air, but if I have to punch out, I'd rather do it somewhere people can find me. Widow 9, we're contacting Bagram now. Stay with the aircraft as long as you safely can. You've done enough, Captain. Don't try to be a hero. Her laugh was short and bitter. Little late for that advice, Actual. I've been a hero for the last 30 minutes. Now I'm just trying to be a survivor. Widow 9 out. The operations center fell silent except for the background hum of equipment and the steady updates from various tracking stations as Keller's damaged aircraft crawled across the Afghan sky. Halloran stood motionless, staring at that green triangle, willing it forward through sheer force of attention. The intelligence officer broke the silence with information nobody wanted to hear. Sir, we're getting weather reports from the route to Bagram. Conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Wind gusts up to 40 knots, visibility dropping below 2 miles in snow, if she has to fly through that with failing controls. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Halloran grabbed a phone, connecting directly to Bagram's tower. This is Major Halloran at FOB Valor. We have an A-10 inbound on emergency status, call sign Widow 9 Captain Nix Keller. She's taken significant combat damage and is barely holding her aircraft together. I don't care what the weather's doing, I don't care what else you have on approach, you clear everything and get her on the ground safely. Do you understand me? The tower controller's response was clipped but professional. Understood, sir. We're tracking Widow 9 now. We'll have crash rescue standing by. Sir, I have to be honest. With the weather closing in and her reported damage, we're looking at a very challenging recovery. Does she have ejection capability? Halloran looked at DeMarco, who shook his head. If Keller ejected, she'd be parachuting into the Hindu Kush in deteriorating weather with Taliban fighters scattered throughout the region. Recovery would take hours, maybe days. She knew that as well as anyone. She has ejection capability, but I don't think she'll use it unless she has absolutely no choice. Just get ready for her. For 20 minutes, they tracked Keller's progress through intermittent radio calls and position reports. Her aircraft was dying slowly, shedding pieces of itself with each mile. The left engine had completely failed. The hydraulic systems were operating on backup, which meant every control input required exponentially more effort. She was flying through sheer determination, muscling an aircraft that weighed 50,000 pounds through hostile sky using systems that were held together by prayers and engineering redundancy. At 40 miles from Bagram, Her voice came through the radio again, strained to the breaking point. Valor Actual, Widow 9. I'm declaring full emergency. Left wing is showing structural damage, flight controls are barely responsive, and I've got multiple fire warnings. I'm going to try to make Bagram, but this is going to be close. If I don't make it, tell those men in the valley it was worth it. Tell them the Reaper's daughter kept her promise. Widdenine out. Halloran's knuckles were white on the handset. Around him, the entire operations center had stopped functioning, every person focused on the drama unfolding in the sky 90 miles away. The intelligence officer pulled up live feed from a camera at Bagram, showing the airfield disappearing into snow and wind. Sir, she's going to have to land in near whiteout conditions with an aircraft that's barely controllable. The odds. I know the odds, Lieutenant, Halloran said quietly. She knows them too. That's what makes her remarkable. The final minutes were transmitted through Bagram's tower frequency, which someone had patched into the operations center's speakers. They heard Keller's strained voice coordinating with air traffic control, heard the calm professionalism of the tower controllers guiding her through the storm, heard the emergency vehicles scrambling into position. Bagram Tower, Widdenine, I have the field in sight, beginning final approach. Aircraft is barely responding to control inputs. If this goes bad, it's going to happen fast. Be ready. Widdenine, Bagram Tower, we're ready for you. Runway is clear, winds are 350 at 35 gusting to 42. You're cleared to land any runway, any direction. Crash rescue is standing by. Bring her home, Captain. Roger Tower, Widow 9 is on final, here we go. Through the speakers, they heard the sound of an engine screaming, pushed beyond its limits by a pilot who refused to let physics win. They heard Keller's breathing, rapid and shallow as she fought the controls. They heard the wind howling around the canopy. Then they heard the screech of tires on concrete, the roar of thrust reversers, and finally, after an eternity compressed into seconds, a voice that shook with exhaustion and relief. Bagram Tower, Widow 9, aircraft stopped on runway, shutting down remaining systems. I'm going to need a minute before I try to climb out. The operations center erupted. Men who'd maintained professional composure through the entire crisis were cheering, pounding desks, embracing each other. DeMarco had tears streaming down his face, not bothering to hide them. Halloran stood motionless, the handset still pressed to his ear, listening to the sounds of rescue vehicles arriving, of firefighters confirming the aircraft was secure, of Keller's shaky voice as she tried to explain the extent of damage to ground crew who were apparently shocked she'd survived the landing. After several minutes, Bagram's tower controller came back on frequency. Fob Valor, Bagram Tower. Widow 9 is safely on the ground. Aircraft is a total loss, structural damage, engine failure, hydraulic failure, multiple penetrations from ground fire. Preliminary count shows 37 hits on the airframe. Captain Keller is ambulatory but exhausted. She's asking if the ground units made it out safely. Halloran raised the handset, his voice thick with emotion he didn't try to conceal. Bagram Tower, Valor Actual. Tell Captain Keller that all 47 men are alive because of her. Tell her they're calling for medevac, treating wounded and asking when they can thank her personally. Tell her. Tell her she's everything the stories say she is, and we owe her a debt we can't repay. Tell her Valor Actual says well done. There was a pause, then the tower controller's voice returned, warmer now. We'll pass that along, sir. Captain Keller says you don't owe her anything. She says that's what A-10 pilots do. We keep people alive. Bagram Tower out. The connection went silent, and for a long moment, nobody in the operations center spoke. They were all thinking about the same thing, about 47 men who would go home to their families because one pilot had refused to accept the mathematics of defeat. About a woman who'd flown a dying aircraft through mountains and weather and enemy fire because quitting wasn't in her vocabulary. About promises kept at altitudes where promises usually died. Halloran set down the handset and turned to face his staff. I want a full combat report on this action within 24 hours. I want every detail documented, every engagement timeline recorded. I want Captain Keller's name in the recommendation for a Distinguished Flying Cross, and I want it expedited. What we witnessed today needs to be in the record. People need to know what one pilot in one A-10 can accomplish when everything's on the line. DeMarco nodded slowly. Sir, the ground units are already talking. By tomorrow, every soldier in theater is going to know what happened in that valley. The story's going to spread. Good, Halloran said. Let it spread. Let them know that when they call for help, someone like Nix Keller might answer. Let them know the Reaper's daughter is real, and she keeps her promises. Outside, dawn was breaking over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere to the north, in a hospital at Bagram Airfield, a pilot named Keller was being checked for injuries that were miraculously minor considering what she'd been through. Her A-10, the aircraft that had carried her through hell and brought her home, was being examined by maintenance crews who kept shaking their heads at damage that should have brought it down miles before the airfield. In the valley where 47 men had been surrounded and dying, the dawn light revealed the aftermath of Keller's assault. Scattered equipment, scorched earth, shell casings by the thousands, and 3 positions, marked by American blood and brass, where men had held on just long enough for salvation to arrive in the form of a gray aircraft with a pilot who refused to let them die. The story was just beginning to spread through the networks that connected combat units across the theater. By nightfall, it would be told in dining facilities and ready rooms from Kandahar to Kabul. Within a week, it would reach stateside units, would circulate through training squadrons, would become one of those stories that defined what it meant to fly close air support. But in that moment, in the operations center at FOB Valor, all that mattered was the simple arithmetic of survival. 47 men had entered that valley. Because of Nix Keller, 47 men had come out alive. Everything else was commentary. Halloran looked at the main display one last time, at the blue icons that were moving steadily towards safety, then turned away. There were letters he didn't have to write now, notifications he didn't have to make. Sometimes, against all odds and probability, the universe delivered miracles. Sometimes those miracles flew A-10s and had call signs that made enemy fighters run and friendly forces cheer. He walked toward his office, already composing the words he'd used to describe what had happened. Behind him, the operations center slowly returned to normal function, monitoring the dozens of other missions happening across the theater. But for the rest of that day, and for many days afterward, the conversations kept circling back to the same topic. To the valley where men had been dying, to the pilot who'd refused to let them die, to the aircraft that had flown home on determination and damaged systems. To the moment when standard procedure and tactical doctrine had met something stronger, a promise made by someone who believed promises mattered more than survival. The sun climbed higher over the mountains, burning away the morning haze, and somewhere in the valleys and ridges of Afghanistan, the war continued its grinding, indifferent march. But for 47 men and 1 pilot, this particular day had become something different. This day had become proof that sometimes, when everything was falling apart and hope seemed mathematical impossible, salvation arrived. Sometimes it wore gray paint and had a cannon that sounded like thunder. And sometimes it had a pilot who understood that keeping people alive mattered more than keeping herself safe. That was the story the field commanders would tell, long after the official reports were filed and the medals were awarded. That was the story that would matter. The formal debriefing took place 3 days later in a conference room at Bagram that smelled of coffee and stale air. Nix Keller sat at the end of a long table, her flight suit replaced by a pressed service dress uniform that looked uncomfortable on someone who'd spent the last 7 months living in cockpits and temporary quarters. Her left hand was bandaged where she'd cut it during the emergency landing, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested sleep had been elusive. Across from her sat a panel of officers representing various commands, all of them wanting their piece of the story that had already circulated through half the military and theater. Halloran was there, along with DeMarco and representatives from the Air Force chain of command. In the corner, a stenographer recorded everything for the official record that would eventually make its way to files in multiple commands. Colonel Vincent Harrow, A staff officer from the Combined Air Operations Center led the questioning. He was a career aviator himself, F-15 pilot with more staff time than cockpit hours in recent years, and he approached the debriefing with the methodical precision of someone building a case study. Captain Keller, let's start with your decision to enter the valley despite being advised of the tactical situation. Walk us through your thought process. Keller's voice was quiet but steady, the same tone she'd used on the radio during the mission. Sir, I monitored the distress calls from the ground units while returning from my assigned patrol. I assessed the tactical situation and determined that, without immediate close air support, those men would be overrun before any other assets could respond. My aircraft was combat-ready. I had sufficient fuel and ordnance, and I had operational familiarity with that terrain from previous missions. The decision to engage was straightforward. Straightforward, Harrow repeated, making a note. You were aware the weather was below standard minimums for flight operations. I was aware the weather was marginal, sir, but I'd flown in worse conditions during my time in Alaska. The ceiling was adequate for safe operations if flown carefully. I determined the risk was acceptable given the alternative was abandoning American forces in contact with a superior enemy force. DeMarco leaned forward. Captain, at any point during the mission, did you consider the possibility that one aircraft might not be sufficient to change the outcome? For the first time, something flickered in Keller's expression, not quite emotion but a sharpening of focus. Sir, respectfully, whether one aircraft was sufficient wasn't the relevant question. The relevant question was whether doing nothing was acceptable. It wasn't, so I engaged. Harrow glanced at his notes. You flew for approximately 34 minutes in the valley, conducting multiple gun runs and precision strikes, all while under fire from prepared positions and man-portable air defense systems. According to the ground unit's reports, you were flying at altitudes as low as 200 feet above ground level. That's well outside the parameters normally used for close air support in mountainous terrain. Yes, sir. The tactical situation required low-altitude operations to ensure precision and to exploit terrain masking from anti-aircraft fire. The A-10 is designed for that kind of mission profile. The A-10 is designed to survive ground fire, Harrow said carefully. But your aircraft took 37 confirmed hits. Several penetrated critical systems. You continued operations despite hydraulic failures, engine damage, and structural compromise. At what point did you consider egressing to preserve aircraft and pilot? Keller's jaw tightened slightly. Sir, I monitored my aircraft systems continuously throughout the mission. I determined that the damage was survivable and that I retained sufficient control authority to continue operations. The ground units required continued air support during their extraction. Breaking off before they were clear would have exposed them to renewed enemy assault. That wasn't acceptable. So you knowingly flew a damaged aircraft in combat conditions, gambling that it would hold together long enough to complete the mission. The question hung in the air, and everyone in the room recognized it for what it was, an attempt to pin down whether Keller had been brave or reckless, whether her actions represented exemplary airmanship or dangerous judgment. She met Harrow's gaze without blinking. Sir, I made calculated risk assessments throughout the mission based on available information and my evaluation of aircraft performance. I prioritized mission completion over personal safety because that's what the situation required. If you're asking whether I would make the same decisions again, the answer is yes. Those men needed me to keep them alive. I kept them alive. Everything else is secondary. The room fell silent. Halloran watched Keller's face, seeing past the exhaustion to something harder and more fundamental, a core of conviction that made compromise impossible. She hadn't just decided to help those ground units. She'd decided they were going to survive, and she'd bent reality around that decision through skill and will and refusal to accept any other outcome. Harrow made another note, his expression unreadable. Let's talk about your background, Captain. You have an unusual career path for an A-10 pilot. You started in F-16s, transitioned to the Warthog after 3 years. Most pilots consider that a step down in terms of prestige. Why did you make that choice? For the first time, something almost like a smile touched Keller's face. "Sir, with respect, anyone who thinks the A-10 is a step down doesn't understand the mission. I transitioned because I wanted to fly aircraft that directly support people on the ground. I wanted to be the pilot that shows up when everything's gone wrong and nobody else is coming. The F-16 is a fine aircraft, but it's not what I wanted to do." "And what did you want to do, Captain?" "I wanted to keep people alive, sir. That's what A-10 pilots do." Halloran leaned forward, speaking for the first time. "Captain Keller, tell us about Alaska. About your background before the Air Force. I think it's relevant to understanding how you were able to accomplish what you did in that valley." Keller's expression softened slightly, memory displacing the professional mask she'd maintained throughout the debriefing. "I grew up in Alaska, sir. Small town called Talkeetna, about 2 hours north of Anchorage. My family ran a bush pilot service, cargo, passengers, medical evacuations to remote villages. I started flying before I was old enough to drive legally. By the time I was 18, I had more mountain flying experience than most pilots accumulate in a lifetime." "That explains the flight handling," DeMarco said, "but not the tactical judgment, not the ability to assess a complex combat situation and improvise solutions under fire. Where did that come from?" "My father was a Navy pilot in Vietnam," Keller said quietly. "F-4 Phantom, flew missions out of carriers in the Tonkin Gulf. He spent a lot of time telling me stories about close air support, about the pilots who kept Marines alive during ground operations. He said those pilots were the real heroes of that war, not the ones who got the glory, but the ones who showed up day after day to fly into hell for people they'd never meet." I guess I listened. Hera was watching her with a different expression now, something that looked almost like understanding. "Your call sign, Widonine. How did you get that designation?" "It was assigned to me during my first deployment, sir. I flew a mission supporting a Marine patrol that had lost their squad leader to an IED. His widow had written a letter to the unit asking them to come home safely. The Marines started calling me Widonine after I provided cover for their extraction. The name stuck." "And the other name?" Harrow asked. "Reaper's daughter. You're aware the ground units call you that?" "I've heard it, sir." "Do you know why?" Keller hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Because I keep showing up when people think they're going to die. Because my aircraft has death's insignia on it, the cannon that sounds like the end of the world. Because I'm willing to fly into situations that other pilots avoid. The ground units started using the name after the Sangin mission. I don't encourage it, but I don't stop them either. If it helps them feel safer when I'm overhead, that's fine with me." Harrow studied her for a long moment. "Captain, some of the officers in this command have expressed concern about your tactics. They suggest you take unnecessary risks, that you push the limits of aircraft performance and tactical doctrine. How would you respond to that characterization?" Keller's voice hardened. "Sir, I fly the missions I'm assigned and I accomplish the objectives I'm given. Some officers are uncomfortable with how I do that. They're welcome to find pilots who are satisfied with textbook solutions to non-textbook problems. But they won't find many volunteers for the missions I fly, and they won't get the results I deliver. The ground units don't care about tactical doctrine. They care about living through the day. I help them do that. And if your tactics get you killed, then I die doing what I chose to do, sir. But I won't die because I was too afraid to try. I won't leave men on the ground because the mission looked too hard. That's not who I am." The debriefing continued for another hour, walking through technical details and engagement timelines, but the essential shape of the story had been established. Keller had flown into a situation that looked impossible and had made it survivable through skill, determination, and a willingness to accept risks that most pilots would refuse. Whether that made her exemplary or reckless depended on your perspective, on whether you valued safety or results, on whether you thought the rules existed to be followed or to be exceeded when circumstances demanded. When the debriefing finally ended, Harrow stood and extended his hand. "Captain Keller, you'll be pleased to know that Major Halloran's recommendation for a Distinguished Flying Cross has been approved and expedited. The medal will be presented at a ceremony next week. Additionally, your actions have been written up as a case study for the weapons school. You're going to be teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots, whether you intended to or not. Keller shook his hand, her expression carefully neutral. Thank you, sir. I just want to get back to flying. About that, Harrow said, your aircraft is beyond repair. It's being written off and sent back to the States for analysis. You'll be assigned a new A-10 from the replacement pool. Maintenance says it'll be ready in a week. A week? Something flickered across Keller's face, not quite frustration, but close. Sir, with respect, there are missions flying every day. Ground units that might need support. I should be back in rotation as soon as possible. Captain, you just landed a combat-damaged aircraft in near-whiteout conditions after flying a mission that would have broken most pilots. You're taking a week to recover, and that's an order. Use the time to rest, to process what happened. Write your own reports. Talk to the men you saved if you want. They've been asking about you. Keller nodded stiffly, clearly unhappy but unwilling to argue with a direct order. As the debriefing broke up and officers filed out, Halloran hung back, waiting until the room was empty except for him and Keller. Captain, can I speak with you for a moment, off the record? She turned to face him, guarded but willing. Of course, sir. Halloran gestured to the chairs, and they both sat. For a moment he didn't speak, just studied the young woman who'd accomplished something remarkable 3 days earlier. She looked exhausted, worn down by more than just the mission. By the attention, by the debriefing, by the weight of becoming a legend when all she wanted was to return to work. You know what's going to happen now, Halloran said quietly. The story's already spreading. By next month, every pilot in theater will know your name. Within 6 months, you'll be famous in aviation communities worldwide. They'll want you to speak at conferences, to write articles, to be the face of close air support. You'll be pulled out of rotation for public affairs purposes. You'll hate every minute of it. Keller's jaw tightened. Yes, sir, I expect all of that, and I'll do my best to avoid it. I didn't fly that mission for recognition. I flew it because men were dying and I could help them. That's all it was. I know, Halloran said, but that's not how the military works. When someone accomplishes what you did, they become a symbol whether they want to or not. You represent something now, proof that skill and determination can overcome impossible odds. People need that story, especially in a war that feels endless and grinding. They need to believe that individual actions still matter. Do they? Keller asked quietly. Does one mission really change anything? Tomorrow there will be another valley, another ambush, more men in trouble. I can't save everyone. Nobody can. So what does this story actually mean? Halloran leaned back, considering his words. It means that 47 men are alive who wouldn't be otherwise. It means their families won't receive notification of their deaths. It means those men will go home someday and tell their children about the pilot who refused to abandon them. Maybe that doesn't change the war. Maybe it doesn't alter the strategic situation or the political calculus. But it changes everything for those specific people. And that's not nothing, Captain. That's never nothing. Keller was silent for a long moment, staring at her bandaged hand. The ground units want to thank me, you said. Do I have to do that? Can't I just let the story exist without making it personal? You could, Halloran said. But I don't think you want to. I think you want to see them to confirm that what you did mattered. You need to look at them and know that the risks you took had meaning. That's not weakness, Captain. That's being human. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, Halloran saw vulnerability in her expression. What if they expect me to be some kind of hero? What if I'm just a pilot who did her job and got lucky? Then you tell them that, Halloran said simply. But I think they'll understand something you might not fully recognize yet. Luck doesn't keep an aircraft flying with 37 holes in it. Luck doesn't thread through mountains in marginal weather while conducting precision strikes under fire. What you did required skill and judgment and courage that goes beyond training. You can call it doing your job if that makes it easier to accept, but those men will see it for what it really was, an act of extraordinary sacrifice. Keller stood slowly, the exhaustion evident in the movement. When are they coming, sir? The ground units. Tomorrow afternoon. Sabre 2 Actual, his real name is Lieutenant Marcus Webb, specifically asked if he could meet you. Said his men want to thank you personally. I told him I'd arrange it. Then I'll be there, Keller said quietly. I owe them that much. No, Captain, they owe you everything. There's a difference. The meeting took place in an open area near the flight line, with the Hindu Kush rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. Lieutenant Webb arrived first, accompanied by 3 other soldiers, his senior NCO and 2 squad leaders who'd been pinned in the valley. They wore combat uniforms that still showed the dust of the mountains, and they moved with the careful precision of men who'd been injured but refused to acknowledge weakness. Keller stood waiting, her service dress replaced by a flight suit that seemed more comfortable, more natural. She'd pulled her dark hair back into a regulation bun, and the bandage had been replaced by a smaller dressing that didn't impede hand movement. When Webb saw her, he stopped, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Then he walked forward and extended his hand. "Captain Keller, I'm Marcus Webb. You saved my life 3 days ago." She shook his hand, her grip firm. "Lieutenant, I'm glad you made it out." "We all made it out," Webb said, and his voice cracked slightly on the words. 47 men, some of them wounded, some of them torn up badly but alive. Every single one of them alive because you flew into that valley when everyone else thought we were already dead. Behind him, the other soldiers nodded, their faces reflecting agreement and something deeper, a debt they didn't know how to articulate. Keller looked at them, these men who'd huddled in shallow fighting positions while hell erupted around them, and felt something shift in her chest. "I just did what needed to be done, Lieutenant. Any A-10 pilot would have done the same." Webb shook his head sharply. "No, ma'am. With respect, that's not true. We'd been calling for air support for 40 minutes before you showed up. We'd been told every asset was committed elsewhere, that we were on our own until the situation stabilized. We were preparing to fight to the last man because we thought nobody was coming. Then we heard your voice on the radio and everything changed. Sergeant Collins here," Webb gestured to the man beside him, "recorded some of your gun runs on his helmet camera. We've watched the footage probably 50 times. You were flying so low we could see your aircraft through the smoke. You put yourself between us and them, over and over, knowing you were taking fire with every pass. That's not just doing your job, Captain. That's choosing to risk everything for people you've never met." The sergeant stepped forward, holding out a small object, a challenge coin, worn and obviously significant. "Ma'am, this belonged to my team leader, Staff Sergeant David Price. He was killed by an IED 2 months ago. Before he died, he told me to give this coin to someone who embodied what he believed a soldier should be. Someone who put others before themselves no matter the cost. I'd like you to have it." Keller took the coin slowly, turning it in her hands. It was old, the edges smoothed by time and handling, and on one face was inscribed a motto, "Others before self." She looked up at Collins, seeing the raw emotion in his face, and felt her own careful control beginning to fracture. "Sergeant, I can't accept this. It should stay with your unit, with people who knew him." "He would want you to have it," Collins said firmly. "You're exactly the kind of person he was talking about. You proved that in the valley." Webb spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying absolute certainty. "Captain Keller, my men and I discussed how we could possibly thank you for what you did. We know there's no adequate way to express what your actions meant. How do you thank someone for your life? For the chance to go home to your family? For the opportunity to grow old instead of dying in a mountain